Breaking news that's sending shockwaves through global energy markets right now. The United States has just completed its first sale of Venezuelan oil since the dramatic capture of President Nicolás Maduro on January 3rd, and we're talking about a deal valued at $500 million. But here's what should concern every American. This is just the beginning of what could be the most controversial energy arrangement in modern U.S. history. Think about this for a moment. Less than 2 weeks after U.S. Special Forces pulled off one of the most audacious military operations in recent memory, Washington is now brokering oil deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars with a country that was considered a hostile nation just weeks ago. In the next 17 minutes, I'm going to break down exactly what's happening here, who's profiting from these deals, and what this means for American energy independence, global oil markets, and the future of Venezuela itself. Let me walk you through exactly what just happened, because the details here are absolutely critical. According to a U.S. administration official who spoke to Reuters on January 14th, the United States has completed the sale of Venezuelan oil, worth approximately $500 million. This represents the first transaction in what the Department of Energy is calling a $2 billion deal reached earlier this month between Washington and Caracas, and it gets worse when you understand the timeline. Here's the background you need to know. On January 3rd, 2026, U.S. Special Forces carried out Operation Absolute Resolve, capturing Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro and his wife from their fortified compound in Caracas. The operation came after Trump imposed a partial oil blockade on Venezuela starting in December, effectively cutting off the country's primary revenue source. According to multiple sources familiar with the situation, Venezuela's state oil company was literally days away from shutting down the country's main crude-producing areas when Maduro was captured. We're talking about permanent damage to oil fields that hold the world's largest proven reserves. Now, less than 2 weeks later, the Department of Energy is orchestrating the sale of approximately 50 million barrels of Venezuelan oil that's been sitting in storage since the blockade began. The revenue from these sales is being held in U.S.-controlled bank accounts, with the main account located in Qatar. Why Qatar? Industry sources say it represents a neutral venue where funds can move with U.S. approval without risk of seizure. But here's where this story takes a troubling turn. The Trump administration selected two massive global commodity trading firms to execute these sales, Trafigura and Vitol. These companies have already paid Venezuela about $50 per barrel and have shipped more than 4 million barrels as of Wednesday, according to people familiar with the deal. Much of this oil has gone to Caribbean storage facilities in Curacao, St. Lucia, and the Bahamas, though it's ultimately expected to end up in U.S. refineries. The human element here cannot be ignored. Venezuela was on the brink of complete economic collapse. The believers' value had crashed on the black market, bringing the country close to another round of hyperinflation. We're talking about a humanitarian crisis that was being measured in days, not weeks. Now let's break down the mechanics of how this deal actually works, because when you understand the details, you start to see just how unprecedented this situation really is. First, the scale of what we're dealing with. Venezuela currently produces about 1.2 million barrels of oil per day, according to December 2025 data. That's down from over 3 million barrels per day in the early 2000s. The country has proven oil reserves estimated at 300 billion barrels, the largest in the world. But here's the problem. Years of mismanagement, sanctions, and underinvestment have absolutely devastated the infrastructure needed to extract and export that oil. When Trump imposed the blockade in December, Venezuela's limited storage capacity filled up fast. The country has approximately 48 million barrels of total storage capacity on land, though not all of it is functional. According to Kairos, a data analytics firm tracking this situation, Venezuela was running out of places to put the oil it was producing. Think about that for a moment. You've got the world's largest oil reserves, but your storage tanks are full and you can't sell anything. That's when production has to stop, and stopping oil production doesn't work like turning off a faucet. Here's the technical reality that most people don't understand. When you shut down oil fields, especially the type of heavy crude Venezuela produces, you risk permanent damage to the reservoir. The geology changes, the pressure dynamics shift. Restarting production becomes exponentially more expensive and time-consuming. Venezuelan officials were staring down a nightmare scenario where their entire oil industry could suffer irreparable harm within days. Enter the U.S. Department of Energy. According to the New York Times, the DOE approached Trafigura and Vitol shortly after Maduro's capture and asked them to execute the sale of trapped Venezuelan oil. Why these two companies specifically? Both firms have the unique capacity to buy and ship large volumes quickly. We're talking about organizations with the global infrastructure, buyer relationships, and financial resources to move millions of barrels in a matter of days. The pricing structure reveals something interesting about market dynamics right now. These trading companies are paying Venezuela approximately $50 per barrel, which industry analysts say is a market price significantly above the roughly $30 that Venezuela was getting paid for oil it previously exported to China while circumventing American sanctions. So Venezuela is actually getting a better deal under U.S. management than it was getting on the black market. But here's the kicker. The revenue isn't going directly to Venezuela's government. It's being held in escrow accounts controlled by the U.S. government under an executive order issued on January 9th, titled Safeguarding Venezuelan Oil Revenue for Rebuilding. The main account is in Qatar, and according to sources familiar with the arrangement, funds can only move with U.S. approval. Now, compare this to historical precedent. The closest parallel we have is the Oil for Food program that the United Nations ran for Iraq between 1995 and 2003. That program allowed Iraq to sell oil on the world market in exchange for food, medicine, and other humanitarian needs. But even that program faced massive criticism for corruption and mismanagement. The key difference here, in Iraq, the UN was managing the program through established international frameworks. In Venezuela, the United States is unilaterally controlling another sovereign nation's oil revenue without clear international legal authority. Legal experts are already raising red flags. Francisco Rodriguez, a prominent Venezuelan economist, wrote on social media that all of these transactions appear to be carried out in a legal vacuum that shields the companies from any type of oversight and accountability. He warned that this makes the bidding and contracting processes vulnerable to corruption. The operational logistics are moving at breakneck speed. By January 14th, Trafigura and Vitol had already shipped over 4 million barrels out of the 50 million barrel total. Additional sales are expected in the coming days and weeks. U.S. officials are now working with Venezuelan interim authorities to figure out how to inject some of this revenue back into the Venezuelan economy to prevent total collapse. The leading proposal involves reestablishing a financial arrangement similar to what Chevron, Venezuela's largest private oil producer, used under the Biden administration until March 2025. Under that system, Chevron funneled revenues it owed the Venezuelan government to the country's private banks, which then sold dollars for bolivars to local companies. Those companies used the hard currency to import goods and make investments. Trump scrapped that system when he returned to office, claiming without evidence that it benefited Maduro. Now, with Maduro in custody and facing trial in New York on drug trafficking charges, the policy is reversing again. So who's actually affected by all of this? Let's break it down by category because the ripple effects are hitting everyone from American workers to international trading partners. For American workers and families, the immediate impact centers on energy prices and geopolitical stability. Venezuela was producing about 960,000 barrels per day before the blockade. Industry projections suggest that number could climb to 1.5 million barrels per day by mid-2026 if these sales continue. That additional supply hitting global markets could exert downward pressure on oil prices, which theoretically benefits American consumers at the pump. But here's the reality check. We're talking about Venezuelan heavy crude, which requires specialized refining capacity. U.S. Gulf Coast refineries are equipped to handle it, but the transportation costs and refining complexity mean the benefits aren't as straightforward as more oil equals cheaper gas. Small businesses dependent on fuel costs are watching this closely. Take the trucking industry as an example. Diesel prices directly impact shipping costs, which affect everything from food prices to retail goods. The Atlantic Council published analysis suggesting that Venezuela's future could help determine U.S. diesel and trucking costs. If Venezuelan crude helps stabilize diesel supplies, trucking companies might see relief. But if this deal creates supply chain disruptions, or if the legal uncertainties cause refiners to hesitate, small trucking operations could face continued volatility. For large corporations, particularly in the energy sector, this represents both opportunity and risk. Chevron is expected to receive a more permissive license from the U.S. Treasury Department in the coming days, allowing it to ramp up operations in Venezuela. A Chevron spokesperson declined to comment, but industry sources indicate the new deal would broadly echo terms set by the Biden administration. That means Chevron could restart projects that were put on hold, but American oil majors like ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips, who were pushed out of Venezuela years ago, are conspicuously absent from these initial deals. The trading houses beat them to the punch. Think about what that means. Vitol and Trafigura, both Swiss-based commodity traders, are now the primary commercial intermediaries for Venezuelan oil sales. They're already in talks with Chinese and Indian refiners to sell cargoes for March delivery. These aren't American companies controlling this massive energy resource. They're international trading giants operating under temporary U.S. licenses. International partners are responding with a mixture of pragmatism and concern. China, which had been Venezuela's primary oil customer through sanctions-evading arrangements, suddenly finds its position upended. Venezuela was exporting roughly 20.8 million barrels to China in December, down from 27.5 million in November. Now that crude is being redirected to U.S.-approved channels. Chinese refiners are negotiating with Vitol and Trafigura, but they're doing it under American terms. The broader geopolitical implications are staggering. President Trump stated publicly that he supports Venezuela remaining in OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Venezuela produced 934,000 barrels per day in November, according to OPEC data. If production increases to 1.5 million barrels per day as projected, that's significant additional supply in global markets. OPEC has been managing production cuts to support oil prices. What happens when a member country suddenly ramps up production under external control? Expert warnings are piling up. Energy economists at Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy point out that increasing Venezuela's oil output will take several years and billions of dollars in investment. The infrastructure has deteriorated badly. Francisco Monaldi, director of the Latin American Energy Program at Rice University, told reporters that the reality is that Venezuela's oil industry is in terrible shape. Even with sanctions relief, recovery will be slow and expensive. Meanwhile, legal scholars are raising fundamental questions about sovereignty and international law. The Chatham House think tank published analysis arguing that the U.S. capture of Maduro and subsequent control of Venezuelan oil have no justification in international law and may represent a watershed moment in post-Cold War international relations. Let me share what the experts are actually saying, because their warnings should be setting off alarm bells across Washington. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent told Reuters on January 10th that additional U.S. sanctions on Venezuela could be lifted as soon as this week to facilitate oil sales. He stated that Treasury is desanctioning the oil to allow commercial flows. That's a remarkable reversal from the maximum pressure campaign that was in place just weeks ago. The legal implications here are genuinely unprecedented. Morgan Lewis, a major law firm advising companies on Venezuela sanctions, published guidance noting that all Venezuela sanctions remain in place, including those prohibiting transactions and activities involving the Venezuelan government and state oil company PDVSA. Yet somehow, the US government is simultaneously managing the sale of oil from that very same state company. The legal framework appears to be developing in real time through executive orders rather than established statutory authority. Political reactions have been sharply divided. Senator Marco Rubio stated that controlling Venezuelan oil revenues prevents them from being stolen by narco terrorists and used to destabilize the region. But international law professor Ann Peters told the BBC that the operation and subsequent economic control crosses a red line in terms of respecting national sovereignty, regardless of Maduro's alleged crimes. Now let's talk about the short-term effects over the next 30 to 90 days. According to people familiar with the deal, the Venezuelan government expects to recover lost production from the blockade period in about a month. That means by mid-February, we could see Venezuelan oil exports return to pre-blockade levels. The immediate beneficiaries are the trading companies processing these deals. Trafigura and Vitol are earning fees on every barrel they move. Caribbean storage facilities are collecting storage fees. U.S. Gulf Coast refineries will process the crude. For Venezuela's economy, economists are projecting a surprising turnaround. Asdrubal Oliveros, a veteran Venezuelan economist, estimates the country's economy could grow 10 to 12% in 2026. Now that sounds impressive until you realize it's coming off an incredibly low base after years of economic catastrophe. It's like saying someone gained 10 pounds after nearly starving. Technically true, but context matters enormously. The medium-term scenario over the next 6 to 12 months depends entirely on infrastructure investment. Venezuela needs billions of dollars to repair and upgrade oil production facilities. Trump has said American companies will make unprecedented investments to restore Venezuela's oil infrastructure. But so far, those commitments are mostly talk. The Council on Foreign Relations estimates it will take at least 3 to 5 years to significantly increase Venezuelan production capacity, and that's assuming political stability, which is far from guaranteed. What about the proceeds in that Qatar bank account? That's where things get really interesting. U.S. and Venezuelan officials are negotiating how to release funds for imports and essential services without violating sanctions that technically still exist on paper. So let's recap the 3 most critical points you need to understand. 1, the U.S. has completed its first $500 million sale of Venezuelan oil, with another $1.5 billion in deals expected soon, marking an extraordinary shift in policy just days after capturing Maduro. 2, the revenue is being held in U.S.-controlled accounts in Qatar, with Washington dictating how and when those funds can enter Venezuela's economy, raising serious questions about sovereignty and legal authority. 3, international trading giants Trafigura and Vitol are managing these sales, not American companies, and they're already negotiating deals with Chinese and Indian refiners. Here's your takeaway. We're witnessing the United States exercise unprecedented economic control over another nation's primary resource, and the long-term implications for international law, energy markets, and Venezuelan sovereignty remain deeply uncertain. What do you think about America essentially managing Venezuela's oil industry?